Welcome to the JavaScript for Pentesters course at Pentester Academy. Now in this video, I will give you a quick introduction to JavaScript and we will write the customary Hello World program. So putting it very simply, JavaScript was invented at Netscape and aimed at providing interactivity with the user. So HTML was really responsible for creating the layout. CSS was pretty much for beautifying the look and feel, and JavaScript was aimed at providing interactivity with the user. Now, typically JavaScript was a client-side scripting language which is interpreted and runs entirely within the browser's sandbox. And this is really the JavaScript which we will talk about in JavaScript for Pentesters. However, please note that lately JavaScript has also been started to use server-side in frameworks like Node.js, etc. These are currently excluded from the scope of this series. Now, in a typical implementation, JavaScript code is embedded within the script tag. Let's take an example. So let's create a file called demo.html. It's a very simple file. A body tag. Close the body tag, close the HTML tag, and as an example, let me put the script tag within the body tag, and let me put in our customary hello world in here. So to go ahead and display an alert to the user, as you've probably seen in previous videos if you're following Pentester Academy, it's simply alert hello JS for Pentesters, semicolon ends it, and we can go in here. We can go ahead and open this file up, let's say in Firefox. And as you can clearly see, we have the alert hello JS for Pentesters. Fantastic. Now, there are multiple places in which JavaScript can be placed. We could even place it above the body within the head tag. So refresh the page, and once again you have hello JS for Pentesters being alerted to us. Fantastic. So this is probably a very simple example. In this series we will learn about writing JavaScript code and then applying it to various use cases for web application pen testing. Now, it is important to note that JavaScript is case sensitive, so you need to ensure that you do not go ahead and mix up upper and lower case when using some of the inbuilt calls, or probably while naming variables and stuff like that, right? Also, it's important to note that the browser executes JavaScript sequentially as it encounters it. So what do I mean by that? If I go back in here and let's say within the body tag, I basically put in an h1 tag. It says hello JS for Pentesters, close the h1 tag, go back in here, refresh this page, and you would notice right now the h1 tag details have not been displayed at all, right? It's simply because the JavaScript code is executing sequentially. The browser executes what it encounters sequentially, and this code is the one which is currently executed. And when we call alert pretty much waits for the user to click on OK, and only after we click OK, the rest of the part would be executed and rendered. So if I click OK, you would now find that the rest of it, hello.js for Pentesters, is now printed on the screen. Now, just to prove that our hypothesis is correct, we could cut out this JavaScript from in here, paste it here, go back, and let's open this up probably totally afresh. And if you notice right now, you already see that hello.js for Pentesters has been rendered, and after that the JavaScript alert is executed, which pops up this screen, right? This proves that we need to ensure when writing JavaScript that we take this behavior into account. That's all I had in mind for this introduction video. In the next video, we would look at variables in JavaScript. Now, if you're enjoying your time here at Pentester Academy, then we would really request and appreciate if you can recommend us to your friends and colleagues in the InfoSec community. Thank you. Welcome to the JavaScript for Pentesters course at Pentester Academy. In this video, we will look at variables in JavaScript. Now, before we begin, please go ahead and ensure that you have Firebug installed. Now, people who are not aware, Firebug is a fantastic Firefox add-on which can be used to edit, debug, and do a ton of other things with CSS, HTML, and JavaScript. It's now becoming one of the primary tools used by web developers, and it's going to help us in many ways in learning JavaScript. So ensure you have it installed. Once the installation is done, under web developer you should see Firebug, and then you can click open Firebug, and this would open up a terminal for you. Just clear what I typed in before. Right now, the right hand side window in here is where you can type in JavaScript and you can run it directly without having to create an HTML page. So let's say here goes, and run this, and this would execute JavaScript as you would like. Okay, so variables. Now, as JavaScript is a dynamically typed language, we do not need to declare data types for variables during the declaration phase. So basically we would say var a, and depending on how we initialize it or later use a, the data type is automatically assigned. So var a equals 100 would mean a is a number. Var a equals hello world, either in double quotes or single quotes, would mean a is a string. And var a equals to either true or false, please ensure the case is always lowercase, is a Boolean value. Now, it is important to note, as we mentioned earlier, that JavaScript is case sensitive, and hence of course variable naming is also case sensitive. Variable names must begin with either a letter or an underscore and never with a number. Also, no reserved keywords like var, etc. can be used as variable names. So now let's just play around. So let's say we define a variable x, And if you just try to alert X, what you would find is you get undefined, right? So a variable which is declared, but you pretty much haven't assigned any value to it, would be undefined. Now let's say we go ahead and mention var x equals 100. Run this. You would see that 100 is displayed on the screen. You could kind of go back in here and say hello world to Pentesters. There you go. Now this is defined as a string. Both single as well as double quotes is allowed. And finally, you could also define this as, let's say, a Boolean value, right? So the true or false. Now, one of the other important aspects with variables is variable scope. Now, a variable which is defined globally pretty much has a global variable scope, and variables which pretty much are defined inside functions are local in nature. Now, we will take up global and local variable scopes in more detail in later chapters. For the time being, just keep in mind that these are the two different scopes which are possible. So that's all for this video. If you're enjoying your time here at Pentester Academy, then we would really appreciate if you can recommend us to your friends and colleagues in the InfoSec community. Thank you. All, welcome to the JavaScript for Pentesters course on Pentester Academy. Now in this video, we will look at operators in JavaScript. Now primarily you have arithmetic, assignment, comparison, logical, and of course Boolean operators. Now let's take up some simple examples with arithmetic operators. So I'm going to be using Firebug just to make it super simple and to clear my previous script. So let's say we have var m equals 100. Now let's define another variable called var n equals 20. Now we can do an addition between m and n and display it inside an alert box. As you can see, 100 plus 20 is 120. Similarly, you could quickly do a subtraction. It gives us 80. A multiplication, which should give us 2000. And finally, a division, which should give us 5. Right? Now, apart from this, of course, you could also have, go back in here, a bunch of other possibilities. Let's say m++ would go ahead and give us 10. Second, so we already had changed the value of m. So let's just go ahead and run this. So m is 100. Now here is the thing, right? This uses the value of m and after that goes ahead and increments it. So we could do a plus m so that the value of m is first incremented and then used. Similarly, you could have a minus m, just give us 99. Alternately, you could do the m++ in here and just display the 101, right? Now you also have assignment operators. So let's say we could pretty much do an n equals m in here, and let's alert n, and as expected n would be 101. Then you have the plus equal to and the minus equal to operators as well. So we could actually go in here and define n to be 200, and then we could basically do an m plus equals n, which, if you aren't from a programming background, is really m equals m plus n. And let's alert m in here, and this would be 300. And similarly, you could have m minus equals n, and this would be minus 100, right? Because m equals m minus n, which is 100 minus 200, which is minus 100. Now similarly, you have the multiplication assignment operators as well. The comparison operators is something which we will take up in later videos, and so will the logical operators. Now, operators are very important because anytime you're manipulating numbers or any interesting data type, they would come into picture. And especially comparison operators, as we'll see in the next video, help us in making decisions in the program flow. So hopefully you've enjoyed this video on Pentester Academy, and if you have, we would really appreciate if you can recommend us to your friends and colleagues in the InfoSec community. Thank you. Welcome to JavaScript for Pentesters at Pentester Academy. Now in this video, we will look at conditional statements. So the most common one is really the if, else if, and else conditional statement. Let me illustrate this with the help of an example. So this is our regular page. We define a variable. We call it b. Let's assign the value 100 to it. I'm going to write an if condition now. If b is greater than 500, alert b greater than 500, else if b equals 500, alert b equals 500, and then finally the last else statement, alert b less than 500. Now, as one you can clearly imagine, given b is 100, we would pretty much end up hitting this statement. Let's try this. There we go, b less than 500. Now let's say we make b equal to 500. Then this would evaluate to equals 500. And then finally, let's say b is 5000. Then you would have b greater than 500, right? Fantastic. Now, of course, you could have many more else if statements in there. So as an example, you could have another else if in here, else if, let's say b equals 300, alert b equals 300. Now when we run this, of course b is greater than 500. Let me make this, let's say 300. So to actually get b equals 300 would be the condition which we would hit, right? So you could have many such else if statements in between depending on what you want to go ahead and conditionally compare against. And this is a very common conditional statement which is used for decisions. The other one is really the switch statement. So let me show you an example. Clear this up. Let's clear this as well. So let's say we have var name equals Vivek, and let's switch on the name. Case, let's say Vivek. This should be alert, say Vivek. Then we have the break statement. So we have case Jack, alert Jack, then again break. And then we have a default condition which is met if no other conditions are met. Have unknown name. Now if we run this, of course we end up hitting Vivek. If we make this Vivek's, we end up hitting unknown name. And finally if we make this Jack, we end up hitting Jack, right? So switch is again a very common struct using which we can go ahead and specify cases, and based on the case which matches you can take action. Of course I've mentioned only one simple statement, the alert everywhere. You could really have a series of statements followed by a break. Now keep in mind that if you remove this break condition, then really what ends up happening is we have Jack in here, and then the default condition is hit as well, right? So that is why the break statement is important with switch. So hopefully you've enjoyed this video, and if you're enjoying your time here at Pentester Academy, then we would really appreciate if you can recommend us to your friends and colleagues in the InfoSec community. Thank you. Welcome to the JavaScript for Pentesters course at Pentester Academy. Now in this video, we will look at loops in JavaScript. Now the very first loop, which is also supremely common, is the while loop. Now the invocation is really simple. You have the while keyword followed by a condition which needs to be always evaluating to true for the loop to continue. Typically the condition is changed inside the loop after the requisite number of iterations are done, so that the while loop would exit. Now let me give you a simple example. Let's take up our very basic HTML file which we had created in the first video, and inside the script tag let me illustrate the use of the while loop. So let's go ahead and define a variable called counter. Let's set this to 100. And now let me implement a while loop where the condition is that counter should be greater than 0. Now inside this, let me go ahead and print using document write, and let's go ahead and print the value of counter. Counter value is, and there we go. Of course, you would have to decrement counter, or else this would end up becoming an infinite loop, which we can do with counter minus minus, which decrements counter by 1. Now we can go back in here, refresh our page, and as we can see, we have some output. Of course, it's all garbled up because we have to ensure this is in a form where the rendered HTML is easy to view. So let's go ahead and encapsulate each of these inside a paragraph tag. Here we go. Refresh the page again, and there it is, right? We can clearly see the JavaScript is running and setting the counter value accordingly. If we view the page source, we would actually find that at this point only the JavaScript is in there, which is eventually run, and this source code is dynamically generated, right? So we can go in here, and if you look at the actual generated source code, we see a ton of p tags, which basically contains all of these little counter values as the counter is decrementing, right? Fantastic. So this is a simple illustration of a while loop. Similarly, the other common looping structure used is the for loop. Now in the case of the for loop, the initialization of the counter or anything else is done first, followed by the condition to be tested, and then finally after each iteration again things to be done are mentioned in here. So if I go back to this very simple example and I'd like to convert this into a for loop structure, then this is how I would do it. For counter equals 100. This is the initialization condition. Let me go ahead and mention var counter up in here. And then after that, the condition should be counter is greater than 0. And at the end of each iteration, the operation is to decrement counter by 1, which ensures we can pretty much remove this statement. So if we go back in here, refresh the page, well, really we don't see anything perceptibly different. So let's say we change the value of counter to 1000 so that we can at least see the output change a little bit. And there you go, right? So this is how you can use looping structures within JavaScript to do repetitive things based on the program logic. Hopefully you're enjoying this video and others at Pentester Academy, and if you do, we would really appreciate if you can recommend us to your friends and colleagues in the InfoSec community. Thank you. Welcome to the JavaScript for Pentesters course and Pentester Academy. Now in this video, we will look at functions in JavaScript. Now, very simply put, a function is nothing but a reusable block of code which can be called from different parts of the program. In JavaScript, you define a function by using the function keyword followed by the function name and an optional argument list. Now inside the function, you also can optionally return a return value. So let's jump right in and take up an example. So again, we use our very basic template, and let me define a function here, and let me call it function call alert. This does not need to have any arguments, and all we're going to do is alert JS for Pentesters. There we go. Now if we go back to our code in here, refresh the page, if you notice nothing really happens, right? That's simply because all we've done is we've defined the function, and unless we call the function somewhere, nothing is going to happen. So let's go back in here and let's call the function. So let's say call alert. Now we go back in here, refresh the page, and there you are, right? JS for Pentesters. Now this was a very simple example in which pretty much all we've done is taken a function without any arguments or return value. Now let's define a function which takes in arguments. So let's say function add numbers num1, num2. Basically we do a document.write sum of num1 and num2 equals and we can define a variable in here called var sum, and this is nothing but num1 plus num2. Over here we could basically call add numbers with the argument 100, 200. Go back, refresh the page, and there we are, right? Sum of 100 plus 200 equals 300. Now what we can also do is return a value and then play with that. So we could remove this statement and basically return sum, and we could define a variable here var m equals add numbers as output, and then we can do a document, or rather we could just do a simple alert with the value of m. $300, as one can imagine. So in this case what we've done is we've made the function return a value, and then we are storing that inside m by defining a new variable in here, and then finally we just use the alert box to show m. Now here is one interesting thing which you need to remember when we talked about global variables and local variables. Now var sum is really local to this function, and if you define anything here totally outside, let's say var global underscore var, it's 100, and over here we again define global underscore var as a local variable, call it 200, and that is what we return back right. Of course, here now add numbers makes no sense. So let me rename the function as well. Call this scope demo. Right. So what you will find, let's refresh the page. What you would find really is that the local variable with the same name pretty much shadows the global variable. In contrast, if we had removed this line, gone back in here, you'd notice that the global variable is what is returned as 100. So this hopefully should clarify the whole idea about scope and the fact that local variables can overshadow global variables within their scope. And this is something you need to remember, especially while naming your variables, to avoid any form of confusion in your program. So hope the concept of functions was well understood. We will be using this off and on in later videos. That's all for this video. If you're enjoying your time here at Pentester Academy, then we would really appreciate if you can recommend us to your friends and colleagues in the InfoSec community. Thank you. Welcome to the JavaScript for Pentesters course at Pentester Academy. Now in this video, we will look at data types in JavaScript. Now if you remember, we'd mentioned that JavaScript is a weakly typed language. And we've already looked at some kind of data types which we can dynamically assign and work with using the var keyword. So let me summarize them and then move on to objects. So as far as numbers are concerned, you can work with whole numbers, decimals in very simple ways, as you can see. Var x equals 10 or x equals 10.12. Strings can be defined using single or double quotes. Boolean, of course, can be true or false. And one new data type in here is array, which we can define in either the regular way, in which we have the square brackets and each item inside of it, comma separated, or we can use the new array keyword and then define the elements inside of array. Alternately, we can first define the array with the new keyword and then assign individual elements using the specific location where we want them to be stored. Now let's move on to objects, which are much more interesting and at the very same time have a little bit of additional stuff which one would need to understand. Now if you're coming from an object-oriented programming background, you would know that objects typically have properties which are really value or data, and they have methods which are associated with certain actions. Now for people who are not from an object-oriented background, no fear, we will touch upon some of the basics. Now let's say we wanted to define vulnerabilities in a proper way by grouping together different aspects of it. So as an example, let's say we would want the CV number as well as a plain text description of the vulnerability and a quick way to check if the current page is vulnerable to a certain attack. So we could define a vulnerability object in which the CE number can be a property, the plain text description can be again a property or really data, and then we can define a function inside which would be the method called isVulnerable, which checks if the current page is vulnerable or not. Now it is important to note here that JavaScript is a prototype based language, and unlike other object-oriented languages, does not need you to define classes. Now, how can we access object properties and methods? It's very simple. This happens with the dot notation. Now we can access a property with the object name dot the property name, and we can call a method by using object name dot method name followed by any arguments which that method may take. Now let's jump right in to an actual example to make things clearer. So let me create a new HTML file, and you can really type along with me. So you can basically have body in there, close the body tag. You can use any text editor. And then let's have the script tag, close the script tag. Now let's go ahead and define our object. So let's say we begin, and let's say we call our object vulnerable, and this takes in basically two inputs in the constructor, the name, or let's rather call it the description, followed by the CV ID of the vulnerability. Now inside of this, we need to go ahead and ensure that the description and CV ID is stored as a property part of the object. Now whenever we want to reference the current object, we use the this operator, and then we can define this dot description equals the description which we received as input, and this dot CVE ID equals CVE ID, right? Now, in order to get an instance of the object, we can define var vulnerable1, and then we can basically use the new operator followed by vulnerable. Now two inputs are required. The first is a description. Let's say XSS in PHP BB, followed by the CV ID. Let's say we call this 1234, right? And then let's alert both of them. So let's say one dot description. Hopefully all my spellings are correct. Then after that, let's alert dot CVE ID. There we go. Now let's go ahead and open this up. And if you notice, the very first part, which is the description, is what is being alerted, followed by the CV ID which we've put in. Right? Fantastic. Now this is really the way you can create a very simple object in which there are two properties, description and CV ID. Now let's extend this and create a method inside the object, right, which can operate on this data and do various tasks. Now one of the ways in which you can define the method is basically by using again this operator, and then say alert vulnerability details. And now as this is a method, we're going to use the function call. Function doesn't take any arguments simply because we are going to alert the data which is part of the object using the description and CVID property. So now we're going to say alert, and we can basically go ahead and say this dot description followed by this dot CVEID. And then we can remove this and just directly call the method for the object alert vulnerability details. Hopefully I do not have any typos in my code. You'll see that in just a second. Go back in here, and if you notice, now we have the vulnerability description, the colon in between, and then the CVID printed together using the alert vulnerability details method of the vulnerable object, right? So this is a simple illustration, and as I said, from a pure pen testing perspective, this is more than sufficient, at least to begin with, for you to try out interesting things with XSS and other stuff. Now in the next video, we will look at another way to define an object method, and then, very important, how to iterate through various properties and methods inside an object. So that's all I had in mind for this video. If you are enjoying your time here at Pentester Academy, then we would really appreciate if you can recommend us to your friends and colleagues in the InfoSec community. Thank you. Hello all. Welcome to the JavaScript for Pentesters course at Pentester Academy. Now in this video, we will continue with looking at objects in JavaScript and look at how to enumerate object properties. Now we are going to take up the base code which we had created in the previous video. So if you haven't had a look at that, please go back, try out the example, and we will use that example as a base to extrapolate further. So I had shown you how to create objects, define properties and methods. Now apart from the regular way, you can also create methods for a given object in an interesting way. So let's say we want to create a method called isVulnerable. So we can do that by calling the name of the object, which is vulnerable, and then use the prototype keyword and then define the method name. So let's say is vulnerable, and let's keep this really simple. You can just define a very simple method which is going to alert XSS, and there we go, right? And for the time being, we can go ahead and probably remove the previous alert box which we were displaying. And now let's call isVulnerable. So this would be one.isVulnerable. There we go. Let's launch the HTML file. And if you notice, we see our XSS in the alert prompt. So this is also another interesting way by which you can define methods and objects. Now let's come to enumerating object properties. So there are primarily three ways. The first includes using the foreign approach, with which you can enumerate properties of an object as defined in arbitrary order, and as far as each distinct property is concerned, you can execute specific statements. The full documentation is available here. Let's quickly implement foreign. So let me remove this isVulnerable call. Now let me implement basically. So let's say for each property which we can call prop in 1 let's go ahead and alert the property name followed by the actual value of the property. There we go. Hopefully there aren't any typos. You can go back in here, launch the HTML file, and we see that the very first property is description, and that has the value XSS in PHP-BB. The next one is the CV ID, and then of course after that you have the methods which are defined. Alert vulnerability details, this is how it is defined, followed by is vulnerable, right? So this is a very common way by which we can iterate through properties. Now let's look at other ways as well. Now the foreign approach goes ahead and provides properties which are there in the prototype chain as well. Now if you're only interested in the object's own enumerable properties, then you need to use object.keys. So let's go ahead and implement that. I'm going to remove this code, or we could keep it, doesn't matter. So I'm going to use object.keys and then pass on the object itself, be 1, and there we go. So this is just going to go ahead and return the keys. Let's go in here. Of course, this is the first part of the code, which is the foreign loop. And now, if you notice, we are being returned the property names. So you have description, CV ID, alert, vulnerability details, so on and so forth. Now similarly, the last approach is basically to use get own property names. Again, we can use a little alert box and actually have object.get own property names, and inside this we give 1. Here we go, and we can remove all of these really just so that output isn't cluttered. Go back in here, so refresh this page, and there you go, right? Fantastic. So this is how you can enumerate different properties from within an object, and this is going to come in very handy when we look at different objects present in the DOM, which we will take up in the next video. So if you're enjoying your time here at Pentester Academy, then we would really appreciate if you can recommend us to your friends and colleagues in the InfoSec community. Thank you. Hello all, welcome to the JavaScript for Pentesters course at Pentester Academy. In this video, we will look at the HTML DOM and how to modify it with JavaScript. So what is the DOM really? Now DOM, or Document Object Model as it is called, is an application programming interface for modifying HTML and XML. Now putting it in very simple terms, one can visualize the DOM as a hierarchical tree in which, depending on the structure of the HTML in question, the different elements are organized. Now, what is interesting from us from a security perspective is, let's say once we find an XSS vulnerability on a given page, how do we find and modify certain elements of interest to us? So let me give you an example. Here is my barebone template page, And let me first define an element. Let's say an h1 tag with an ID as title. This, or rather, welcome to JavaScript for Pentesters. Now, inside JavaScript, if we want to find this specific element, then we can go ahead and use the get element by ID call. So here is what we're going to do. So we go in, and now let's actually use document with which we refer to the current document and do a get element by ID. And the ID in here is title. Now let's assign this to a variable so that we can play with that variable. Of course, there's no real need. Once you're proficient with JavaScript, you could probably write everything down in one single line, but we leave that for later. So let's say, let's call this var1, and now let's manipulate this. Now to manipulate the HTML which is enclosed within that element, we use var1.inner HTML. And let's call this XSS for Pentesters, right? So here is what we are doing. We have an h1 tag with the ID title. We are going to use document.getElementById title and then change the inner HTML to XSS for Pentesters. So let me go in here and let's open this up, and there you go, right? As you can clearly notice, we've modified it. Now, in case you wanted to look at slightly slower motion, just before this, we can insert an alert. This is a break, right? And if we restart the page, you would notice that welcome to JS for Pentesters is still there. And as soon as we are going to click OK on this is a break, our JavaScript would now modify this to XSS for Pentesters. Now in examples which we will take up later, this can come in exceedingly handy when you want to modify things on the page once you've found an XSS vulnerability. And now you're pretty much looking at how powerful this can be. Now, apart from using getElement by ID, there is also another interesting one, which is getElements by tag name. There's another for class as well, but we'll look at tags for the time being. Now, if you notice, this is getElements because what it returns back is really a collection. So let's go in there and let me define two h2 tags. This is h2. This is the first tag. Let's close the h2 tag, and then let's have another h2 tag which says this is the second tag. Again, let's close it. We remove this alert box from in here. Now, in order to go ahead and get the entire collection of h2 tags, here is what we can do. Let's say var, and let's call this h2 tags equals document. Now in this case, we would do a get elements, note the plural, by tag name. So we're going to do a get elements by tag name, and the tag name is h2. Now this is an HTML collection, and if you want to know the length, we can alert it using h2 tags dot length. So this will tell us the length of this collection or rather the number of unique elements in there, which you would expect to be 2. So let's go back in here, refresh this page, and as you can clearly see, we basically get 2. Now, here is what we can do. You could go ahead, reference h2 tags, refer to the second element with a 1 dot inner HTML, and change this to, this is the third tag, even though it isn't. And now when we go back in here, do a quick refresh, 2 is here. And if you notice, the inner HTML changed this to, this is the third tag. Now you can clearly see how with JavaScript, we can pretty much control smaller details of the HTML being rendered on the page. Now it is also possible to iterate through these tags. For example, I could do a quick counter for I is equal 0, I less than h2 tags dot length, I plus plus, and then I could just alert the inner HTML, h2 tags I, so that we get the specific position through which we are iterating, and do an inner HTML. There we go. So here goes. Have the first alert for the length. This is the first tag is what get represented, and then this is the third tag is what we get after that. So here are simple examples by which we can find elements by ID or tag names, iterate through them, change their value, and if you go through the specifications, you can even change smaller attributes and whatnot, right? Which I leave to you as an exercise. Now this will come in very handy when we want to access a specific element on the page and modify it, as we will see in later examples. So that's all I had in mind for this video. If you're enjoying your time here at Pentester Academy, then please do recommend us to your friends and colleagues in the InfoSec community. Thank you. Welcome to the JavaScript for Pentesters course at Pentester Academy. Now in this video, we will look at event handlers in JavaScript. So what are event handlers? Well, once the page is loaded in the browser and the user is interacting with it, there are tons of events which keep going on, such as the user clicking, hovering his mouse over elements like images and whatnot. Now, we would want to ideally go ahead and react to many of these events, and this is done using event handlers. An exhaustive list of event handlers is available in this link. In this video, I will show you how to go ahead and write event handlers for some of the events. So the first way is really something you're probably used to based on the XSS videos which we've shown you and some of the challenges. So as an example, let's say you wanted to do an on-click handler, so that when somebody clicks on welcome to JavaScript for Pentesters, this is executed. So the way in which you do it as part of the HTML tag is write the name of the event, such as onClick, and then mention the actual handler. So here it is. Let's say we do a quick alert on click handler. Now let's go back in here. This is demo 2. Page is loaded. Now if I click on welcome to JavaScript for Pentesters, the onClick handler is called and it displays this text, right? So this is the first way by which we can define an event handler. Let me remove this. The other way is first finding out the element and adding the handler. So let's say, here it is, document.get element by ID. And in this case, the ID, as you can see, is JS. And over here, we can add the handler such as onClick, or let's do an on mouse over, right? So that when we hover our mouse over this specific h1 tag, then this handler gets activated. Equals function give an event object which can come in as input, which we won't use right now, and then alert, let's say on mouse over handler, and there we go. So hopefully if we do not have any typos in there, as soon as we hover our mouse, this handler is going to get activated, as you can clearly see. So this is the second way by which we can introduce event handlers. Finally, the third way is by using add event listener. So you can actually do an add, lowercase add event listener, and the event which you are interested in is, let's say, mouse over. Note the fact that the on word is omitted in here, right? Keep that in mind, on is omitted. Then write this whole thing. Actually, this time let me make this a click, right? Just so that we know the code has changed and that the new code is the one which is working. There we go. Nothing happens in here. Click, and then the click handler runs, right? So these are the three different ways by which you can write event handlers using JavaScript. Depending on the specific case in question of the XSS or whatever we want to do, we could use either one of these three. So I would highly recommend that you look at the full list of different events which are present, which you can tap into in the list given in here, and play around with the different event handlers. Now, if you're enjoying your time here at Pentester Academy, we would really appreciate if you can recommend us to your friends and colleagues in the InfoSec community. Thank you. Hello all, welcome to the JavaScript for Pentesters course on Pentester Academy. In this video, we will look at how to work with cookies in JavaScript. Now, if you followed the XSS videos till now, you'd probably already be convinced about how important cookies are in going ahead and hijacking a user session and assuming his identity. So in this video, we will look at how to set, modify, delete cookies using JavaScript. Now I've given you a link to the developer documentation of the document.cookie object in JavaScript, which contains all the cookies. So let's jump right in to some concrete examples. Now I'm again going to take up our very simple template page which has a script tag in it. Now to go ahead and create a cookie, we just use document.cookie, and let's call this session ID and give it a long random number. Now let's verify that the cookie has actually been set. Now it's important to note that we cannot just run the file as is, simply because we would have to associate the cookie with some domain. So to do this, let's run a web server, a really barebone one, on the same page. So the name of the file is demo.html, which we are creating here. And let me run our Python server. So simple HTTP server, which we've created. And this is now bound to port 8000. So let's go in here and say localhost 8000 demo.html. And if you notice, the cookie session ID has this long random value, which is really what we set in here. Fantastic. Now it is possible, of course, to set multiple name value pairs, and we can very simply do this by just calling document.cookie equals, once again, let's call this user ID equals 999. Now note that this just appends rather than removes, which means session ID equals this long random value will also exist. And just to prove that real quick, let's refresh the page again. So we have session ID first set to this value. And of course, we have not put in the second alert. And of course, right now, because the cookie is already set, you would actually see both of them in the first shot itself, right? Both user ID equals 999 and session ID equals to the long random value. Now it is possible, of course, to iterate through these values as well. So I think now we could go ahead and remove our alerts. And we can even comment these out simply because the cookie values have now been set and it's up to us to remove them. So you could actually do basically cookies equals document.cookie, and because our cookies are separated by colon, we can actually do a split by colon. So the split method goes ahead and splits the string up using the delimiter colon. So cookies is really, basically something which we can iterate over. So we can do a very simple var I equals 0, where I is less than cookies dot length I plus plus, and then we can quickly do an alert cookies I, so that we iterate through each of these cookies, right? So let's verify that our code works perfectly. Hit and enter. Here is the first cookie, or rather the first name value pair, and here is the second name value pair. Fantastic, right? So this is how we can iterate through this string. Now, if you would like to modify the cookie value, so let me actually remove this. Then you could very simply just change this to whatever you want, and this would eventually end up in overwriting the existing value. Let's say to -1234, and now we can actually do a alert once again, and you would find that this specific value has been overwritten. So if you notice now, session ID is -1234, right? Or rather, sessions ID is what we've called it. So we've looked at how to set, we've looked at how to modify, we've looked at how to iterate, and now finally, let's look at how to remove. Now the easiest way to remove a cookie is actually to set its expiry date to something in the past, right? So here is what we are going to do. Document.cookie equals, you just paste this in, and then append expires equals a date which is probably in the past. So let's say Friday 24th Jan 2014. Let me keep this value to all zeros. GMT, right? This is a date in the past as of now. And now if I do an alert document.cookie, you would actually find that sessions ID would actually be removed. And we should also zero out the value, or rather put no value there. So let me just do a quick check. It seems okay. And now if you notice, the cookie has been removed, right? Sessions ID is no longer there, only user ID 99 is there. And we can pretty much verify it by just refreshing the page again. Right, there you go, right? You kind of set it in here. And if you remove this set clause as well, then you would pretty much not see it at all. Right? Fantastic. So this is how one can play with JavaScript to set, modify, and delete cookies. This functionality is something which is very important, and we would use time to time in more interesting examples. So that's all for this video. If you're enjoying your time here at Pentester Academy, then we would really appreciate if you can recommend us to your friends and colleagues in the InfoSec community. Thank you and have a great day ahead. Hello all. Welcome to the JavaScript for Pentesters course on Pentester Academy. Now in this video, we will look at how to steal cookies using JavaScript. Now, we've looked at XSS in which we identify a specific page in which we can inject our JavaScript. We've done a couple of examples where we actually pop the cookie within an alert box. Now, as you can imagine, this is of fairly limited use apart from a pure proof of concept. Now, in the real world, what you would want is that once you have control of the cookie, or rather access to the cookie, you would want to post it back to your own server so that then you can impersonate the user. Now in this video, we will look at a couple of examples on how we can do that. So let's jump right in. So I'm going to be using the same template with session ID, or rather, let me just call it session ID. We have an extra S in here. Set to a long random number. And we can alert this just to ensure that we are sure this has been set. So let's jump right in. Let me refresh the page, and there we are, right? So just like in the previous video, I have my Python simple HTTP server up and running. Of course, you can do this example using Apache or any other server as well. Okay, so the very first way in which you can post the cookie back is using document.location. Now, to be honest, any technique with which we either load a resource or post a resource to a third-party server would do. I am just taking some of the more common examples which are used, but pretty much you can do your own research and figure out other interesting ways as well. Okay, so one of the ways is to set document.location, and let's say I set this to location, port 8000 is the local one, demo.html, which is really the same page. Let me kind of set this to something else probably, and let's say we paste the cookie using document.cookie. Right now, document.location pretty much changes the address bar and takes you to that specific new location which you've mentioned here, right? So this is a slightly intrusive way, of course, but let's do a demo. And the most important thing to note is that the cookie would get posted here as we hit this new URL which we mentioned in here. Okay, so let's jump right in, hit an enter. If you notice, we were kind of directed to location 8000 question mark session ID equals blah blah blah. Of course, there's nothing running there, and of course we haven't caught anything as well because this is running basically on port 8000. So let's do the following. Let me actually do localhost in here. Actually, it's my mistake. There you go. And if you notice, we got the session ID posted here, which is really the cookie in question. Now, the important thing to note is that even though we've created a script which is posting back to the same server, could actually change this to pretty much post anywhere. So I could actually post this to a server I control, and in your case, which you as the pen tester controls, let's say securitystube.net, and could go back in here. And if you notice, we are having a redirect, and right now I am gone to securitystube.net, right? So if I was in control of securitystube.net and I saw my local web server logs, then I would actually find the session ID posted here, which I can then impersonate and use with this application to hijack the user session, right? So document.location is one of the techniques. Now the other technique is using an image file where source is actually set to the URL where you want to post the cookie. So there are multiple variations. The first one is, let's say we do a write in the document, so document.write, and then we have our image tag source equals. Now for these demos, I'm going to use localhost, but as I showed you, you could pretty much be using any host on the internet. So localhost 8000, and then after that, we could pretty much have our cookie in here. Should we do a quick question mark? Right, close this, and then close this tag. So this is actually going to write an image tag with source equals where we want to post the cookie, right? So let's go back in here. Here we go. And if we go back in here, we'd actually see, let's do this once again. We would actually see that the cookie got posted, right? Now, if you notice, one of the key problems here is this broken image symbol. You could fix this by actually mentioning the height and width of the image somewhere. So let's say height equals 1, width equals 1 again. Now this ensures that because the image is actually smaller than even this broken image tab, it's no longer going to be shown. So let's hit this. There you go. It's eliminated. And if you go back in here, you notice that we again got a post. So let's try this again. Right? Fantastic. Now, one of the other alternate ways is really to just go ahead and instantiate a new image with source and really not kind of add it to the document for the time being, right? So to do that, we actually comment out this line. And here is what we can do. We can have a new image, and basically the source of which points to the place where we want to post the cookie. Right? There we go. Go back in here. Let me also kind of change this value just so that we know it's a new value which was set when we record it. And here you go. This new value is now posted to our server, right? Now, as I mentioned before, even though we are using local host so that I can quickly show you that we've actually caught the cookie in our logs, you could pretty much be using any server on the internet, right? So these are a couple of examples how very simply you can post the hijacked cookie to the attacker server, and then the attacker will probably impersonate the user by using this cookie. There are many other techniques. As I said, typically the whole idea is to actually go ahead and either fetch or post something to the server where we are actually using document.cookie as one of the parameters, right? So hopefully you enjoyed this video. This is a very important concept which I've covered here. So please try this out on your own. And if you're enjoying your time here at Pentester Academy, then definitely we would really appreciate if you recommend us to your friends and colleagues in the InfoSec community. Thank you. Hello all. Welcome to the JavaScript for Pentesters course on Pentester Academy. Now in this video, we will look at exceptions in JavaScript. So what are exceptions? Now in your program, errors will happen, and that's something most programmers know that it is almost inevitable. However, one needs to handle these errors in a graceful way, and this is where exception handling comes in. Now basically the try catch finally block is pretty much the standard for handling exceptions in most object-oriented programming languages. So I've given you a link, but let me illustrate how try catch finally works. So I've taken a very simple HTML file which you can recreate, and inside the script tag, let me put in the try catch finally block. So within the try block, we actually put something which we feel can have an error. Now when the error happens, we need to go ahead and catch that error, and what we would like to execute after we catch that error is what goes inside the catch block. And we of course want to do some cleaning up, regardless of whether the error happens or not, and that is mentioned in the finally block. So finally runs regardless of whether an error happens or not, right? So we run code within the try block. If an error or exception happens, then the code within the catch block executes, and then after that finally executes, right? If there is no error, then the try block first executes, then the finally block, and then we are out of this. Now let's go ahead and take an input so that we understand what the exception was, and we'll put that inside the error variable or err variable. So let me actually forcefully cause an error by calling a function which really does not exist. And we can go in here and let's print this error. So let's do a document.write, and let's basically write error was, and basically error.message, so we know what the error was. Finally block, we can actually do a document write runs regardless of if error happens or not. Right, here we go. Now let's go back in here, let's run this, and if you notice, basically error was, and it says does not exist is not defined, and then after that we have the finally block which prints, or rather writes, runs regardless of if error happens or not. And we can verify this by removing this line entirely, which causes the exception. Let's refresh the page, and if you notice, now there is no exception which happened, and hence the catch block did not execute. However, finally still executes, where you can write your cleanup code. Fantastic. Now this is an example of how built-in exceptions would be handled. Now what if you want to define your own custom exceptions? So the easiest way is actually to use the throw keyword followed by the exception. So let's say this is a custom exception, and inside the catch block let's print basically the exception which happened by doing the document.write, and we basically are going to say error was, there we go. Let's refresh the page, and if you notice, it says error was, this is a custom exception, right? And again, the finally block runs regardless of whether there was an exception or not. And we can again verify that by removing this line, refreshing the page, and there you go, right? So this is how you can implement custom exceptions. So hopefully this was fun. From a pure pen testing perspective, you probably might not be writing exception handlers, but a lot of times when you're looking at other people's JavaScript code to see if you can exploit any vulnerability in it, you may find these try-catch exception blocks to be in there, and hence it is important that we understand how it works. So that's all we had in mind for this video. If you're enjoying your time here at Pentester Academy, then please do recommend us to your friends and colleagues in the InfoSec community. Thank you. Hello all, welcome to the JavaScript for Pentesters course on Pentester Academy. Now in this video, we will look at advanced form manipulation. Now from a pen tester's perspective, forms are a very important thing simply because when you find an XSS or an HTML injection on a page with a form, you can enhance your proof of concept pretty much to do really interesting things. Now depending on what you want to do, the building blocks pretty much remain the same. So the first, of course, is intercepting a form submit or any other event in the form you're interested in. Now, a form submit would typically ensure that before the data is posted on the server, you would probably get to read it, maybe modify it, and then decide what needs to be done, including either not submitting the form or allowing the form to be submitted either to the original server or a server controlled by you. Now in this video, we are going to look at all of these demonstrations. So let's jump right in. Now I've created a very simple template HTML file containing a form, and this form just has a username and a password field. You should be able to download this template from the link below the video. So this is how the form looks like. Very simple. And at this point, the form gets submitted to /authenticate, which doesn't exist. So, I mean, even though we aren't at this point going to submit or do anything with the form, just keep in mind this is a URL on the server, right? Now, the first thing, of course, is that you would have to intercept the form submit. Now, when we do a couple of exercises in the challenges section, you will have to exploit an XSS and then insert all of this JavaScript. In this example, of course, I am assuming that you can write JavaScript on the page and which would execute. So the first thing, of course, is to ensure that we can tap into the submit event. So first, of course, is to write a function which would go ahead and process that event. Let's call it intercept form. For the time being, let's not write anything inside. Now, in order to be able to ensure that intercept form is called whenever the submit button is pressed, we are going to say test.submit. Now, if you notice, test is the ID of this specific form equals intercept form. Now this should be clear because we've already covered this when we talked about events in JavaScript, right? Sorry, it's test.onSubmit because that is really the handler. Now inside this, there's something very interesting. Now if this function returns a true, then the form submit proceeds. If this returns a false, then the form submit will not happen. So let me try this variation. Let's do a return false. And let me go back in here, refresh this page, and let me feed in, let's say, ABCD, XYZ. Let me click on submit. And if you notice, nothing really happened, right? Now, if I go back in here and convert this to a true, let me refresh the page, put in Vivek, ABCD, click on submit. If you notice, the form submit went through. Of course, /authenticate doesn't really exist anywhere, so it failed, right? So this is the first thing I want you to take note of, which is we can control if the form will be eventually submitted or not, right? Now let's say currently we are not interested in submitting the form. Rather, we are only interested in playing with the form. Now, the first thing is, how can we read the different values the user has typed in into this? So there are really two ways. One is you can use the different IDs of these form elements and all of that to reference. So as an example, let's do an alert of document.form forms. I'm going to reference this by the ID test. And then inside of it, let's say I want username, so I can reference this by username, right? And after that, we can pretty much say dot value to figure out the current value. There we go. Let me refresh the page. And let's click on submit. And if you notice, the value Vivek was alerted, right? I can pretty much put anything in here, and that would be inside the alert box. So this is one way. The other way is, if let's say the IDs are not mentioned, then we could reference it by the form number. Let's say this is form 0, so only one really. And then the elements of that form, we are picking up the first one now. 0 was username, pass would be 1. And then we can display the value, right? So let's go back in here. Let me refresh this form page. Let me put in my ultra secretive password. You can basically say never for this site, so we aren't bothered anymore. And that is my ultra secret password, as you can clearly see, right? Fantastic. So what we've learned till now is how to intercept the submit event, ensure that we can probably fail the submit and really do nothing. We've also learned how to read the different values from the form. Now let's look at how to modify it. Now, if you're thinking it's anything complicated, you couldn't be further away from the truth. It's probably simpler than you realize. All we have to do is put this to whatever we want. Now in this case, I'd like to change the username field so that we can view it. And let me call the name Jacob, right? I'm going to refresh the form, go back in, put in something arbitrary, reflect the username, password, but keep looking in here. After this, if you notice, the username field was changed to Jacob automatically, right? And this is really the power of JavaScript, which is we can change things on the fly. Now, this is how you modify different values in the form. Now that we've seen how to modify values, let's look at how to submit this form to the attacker controlled server. First thing which needs to be done, of course, that we need to set up a web server where we can get this information sent through our JavaScript. So that's simple. Let's use netcat and start listening on port 8000. Go back in here. Now, all we need to do is change the form action, which currently points to /authenticate, to the URL which we desire. So we can actually do a document.form0, copy it, paste it in here, .action equals our URL, let's say localhost 8000, and that's it. Now, of course, we would want the form to be processed, or rather submitted, so let's return a true. Now I can go back in here, refresh the page, type in security tube and a long complicated password. Here is our username, here is the password, and if you notice, looks like we are submitting to localhost 8000 question mark blah blah blah. If I go back in here, we have received all of that data, right? Now, because the attacker's web server, which I'm simulating, isn't a real server at this point, pretty much we are just hung waiting for the response. Now, in the real world, the attacker would have this server and could even redirect back to the original website, which will ensure that the victim might not even notice that the form was submitted to the attacker's website, right? Fantastic. So hopefully this illustration was very clear, and now you're able to read, modify, and post the form to arbitrary URLs which you control. Hopefully you've enjoyed this video, and if you like what you see here on Pentester Academy, then we would really appreciate if you can recommend us to your friends and colleagues in the InfoSec community. Thank you. Hello all, welcome to the JavaScript for Pentesters course at Pentester Academy. Now in this video, we will look at HTML parsing along with XHR. So the logical question arises, what role does HTML parsing play which can come in handy to a pentester? Now, let's say you found an XSS vulnerability on a website and maybe you want to traverse the application by going through links, posting data and all of that. Now, at this point, the response you receive from the server most of the times is just going to be HTML pages. Now, depending on if you need to extract data from one of these pages and then use it to traverse to the next level of the application may vary from application to application. Now, you may need to extract links, form fields, CSRF tokens, and many other things. This is where if you go ahead and try to parse the received HTML page as a text variable, it's going to be very, very difficult, right? You would have to implement your own parser. Now, wouldn't it be great if you could do your regular DOM parsing on the HTML which is returned as part of the XHR response? This is exactly what we are going to look at in this video. Now the good news is there is a way by which you can handle HTML and do all your cool DOM parsing etc. using XML HTTP request. Now before we get into how, let's understand what is disallowed. Now you can only use the automatic HTML parsing capability for asynchronous requests and not for synchronous XHRs. Second, it's important that the HTML support is only going to work when response type property is actually set to document. Now let's jump right into the link here on Mozilla's website. Now the usage itself is really very simple. Once you set the response type to document and you go ahead and receive the response, you can pretty much parse it the way you were doing with your DOM parsing, right? So have a look at this page, read through the documentation. I'm going to take up a very simple example. Now here is a page which is vulnerable to an XSS using the variable URL, which is a parameter passed in, and what you need to do is basically fetch HTML pages from other challenges which are there here. So as an example, let's pick up challenge 2. So what we would need to do is, using the XSS vulnerability, I want you to fetch this page which is at challenge 2 and then go ahead and post all of these links, the actual URLs, on this page, right? This is what we are going to do. The URLs are included at the bottom, so it should be okay for you. So let's try and understand how we can do that. Now the whole process starts exactly like a regular XHR, which is var request equals new XML HTTP request, and then we open the URL we want to fetch. In this case, it's /lab webapp jfp true. And keep in mind that this is an asynchronous request. We set the response type to document so that HTML parsing can happen automatically. Now, once we receive a response, we are going to use request.response.xml to get the HTML page. And after that, exactly like what we've done in previous videos, you can now query the DORM using your methods such as get elements by tag name and whatnot. So we get elements by tag name, let's say the A tag, and after that we run a very simple loop in here to go ahead and concatenate all the links and then finally display them inside the result div, right? So I guess the key thing here to ensure that you can parse the HTML returned as response to the XHR is to ensure you make an asynchronous request and that you set the response type to document. After that, it's pretty much what you've done before. So let's encode this, copy it out, paste it in here, and there we go, right? All the 4 links have been fetched and they are displayed. Fantastic. So this is a very important concept which I would highly recommend that you look into, because once you find an XSS vulnerability, you may want to traverse through the app, different workflows, and try out different things. And this is where the ability to parse HTML as response to your XHR is very, very important. So hopefully you've enjoyed this lesson at Pentester Academy, and if you have, we would really appreciate if you can recommend us to your friends and colleagues in the InfoSec community. Thank you. Welcome to the JavaScript for Pentesters course at Pentester Academy. Now in this video, we will look at XML HTTP request and JSON parsing. So for some of you who've never heard about JSON, JSON is JavaScript object notation, and very simply put is a text-based data exchange protocol used by applications on the web. Now it's text-based, at the very same time human readable, and data can be arranged in a hierarchical way. Now on the web you would find a lot of Ajax based applications using JSON instead of XML, as JSON is much more lightweight and very easy to process within JavaScript. For more information on the type of variables and everything which you can use, visit the Wikipedia page given below. Now I'll give you an example of how JSON can look like. So here is an example where the response basically has a JSON based structure. Vuln is 3, and after that you have num1, and if you notice, inside that there are nested name value pairs. Now this is really, when I said JSON has hierarchical order, this is what I meant. So you have num1, the first vulnerability, version of software 1.41, description buffer overflow, software is dempass. Similarly you have num2 and num3, right? Now the actual structure, the hierarchy, the level of nesting, all depends upon the application which is serving the JSON response, which in turn of course depends on the web application itself. So why is JSON parsing important to a pen tester? Now just like in the previous case for HTML parsing, when you find an XSS, traverse through the application, a lot of modern web apps use APIs which may return JSON. Now this is where it is important that you can pass that JSON response and use it effectively within your XSS payloads. This is the reason why we are looking into JSON parsing. Now, the best way to parse JSON is using json.parse, and let's jump right into an example. The link to this example is given below the video, or if you're watching this offline, it should be in the list of links in the file. Now, if you notice, this specific application is vulnerable to XSS. The injection can happen using the URL parameter, and the objective say fetch the JSON response from this location and list all the vulnerabilities. So let's actually first go to this location, paste it in, let's see what's in there. So we see a JSON response, which is exactly what we saw on the slide. So this is something we need to parse, and we need to display the vulnerabilities within a div tag with ID result, right? And we can figure that out if you do view page source. Here is the div tag with ID result. Fantastic. So to save time, I've already scripted out the solution, which we will go through step by step in just a bit. Okay. So just like in a regular XHR, we first go ahead, initiate a request to the URL. This is the same URL where the JSON data is available. And in the handler, we use json.parse, and the input of which is request.response text. Note that JSON is returned as response text. Now, in this object, now you can reference the values directly. So to give you an example, copy this out, actually go and look at the data. So the very first one is 1, which is 3. Let's verify we can do that. So response object dot vuln. Let me encode this, copy this out, go back in here, paste it, and there you go. If you notice, 1 has the value 3, which is now alerted. Now after this, let's say you want to go ahead and dump the second software name checker. So this would be num2.software. So we go back in here, num2.software, code it, copy it out, go back in there, paste, and there you go, right? So it's very simple, as you can clearly see, after using json.parse to actually work with the returned JSON value. Now I'm just going to go ahead and do a part of the solution. Now in this case, taking the response object num1.software and then num1.version and num1.description, concatenating it, and I'm going to display it in the div with ID result. So encode this, copy this out, paste it, and there you go, right? Now I leave it to you as an exercise to display all of them, using a loop or with similar such statements. It's up to you. So hopefully this video was fun and educational, and this is how you can parse JSON in JavaScript. If you're enjoying these videos, then we would really appreciate if you can recommend Pentester Academy to your friends and colleagues in the InfoSec community. Thank you. Hello all, welcome to the JavaScript for Pentesters course at Pentester Academy. Now in this video, we will look at XML HTTP request and XML parsing. So I guess all of you would be knowing what XML is, and that's an assumption I'm making. Very simply put, it's a very understandable way to represent data, and typically that data is arranged in a hierarchical order. So here is one example I've taken up from MSDN of an XML file, partially shown of course. Now in this demo, we are going to actually work with exploiting the XSS and then going ahead and parsing the XML. So let's jump right in. So this is the demo in which the XML is actually located in this URL, which is this, and as we can clearly see, under catalog you have multiple books, and under every book you have author, title, and a bunch of other parameters. Now in this example, I'll show you how to go ahead and get all the book titles and put them in an alert box, one after the other, right? So the first part of course is exploiting the XSS and making the XHR for the XML data file. Now just so that we don't end up repeating a lot of stuff we've already seen before, just going to copy paste a bunch of code. Okay, so we have a new XML HTTP request, we have the onReady state change function defined, and we are going to go ahead and make an XHR for the XML data file, which is located in this URL. Now once this returns, the best part about request.response XML is that you can query it using your familiar get elements by tag name and other similar methods, right? This pretty much brings us back to what we did with HTML, and that's what makes it so cool and easy to work with. So XML processing is, as you can clearly see, is very simple in this case. So here is what we are going to do. Let's go ahead and alert the number of titles we have. Very simply be titles.length. Okay, let's encode it, copy it out, go back in here and paste it. And if you notice, we get the response 12. So there are 12 titles in the XML data, which is in here. Now let's say we want to go ahead and alert all the titles within this. So here is what we are going to do. We're just going to run a very simple for loop, and just like what we've seen in the case of HTML, titles I.child node 0 dot node value is going to give us the actual text within the title tag, right? So hit encode, copy it out, go back in here, paste it. Here is the first title, and so on and so forth, right? Fantastic. So as you can clearly see that if you are already adept with HTML processing, which we've seen way before in JavaScript for Pentesters, the XML processing part is actually quite simple and trivial and is pretty much the same, right? So keep this in mind. So hopefully you've enjoyed this video, and if you're having fun at Pentester Academy, then we would really appreciate if you can recommend us to your friends and colleagues in the InfoSec community. Thank you.